Last night, you drank too much. This morning, your head is pounding, your stomach hates you, and you'd probably pay good money for a miracle cure. But here's the strange part. A human who lived 12 thousand years ago may have recovered from this exact situation better than you do today. No pharmacy, no painkillers, no sports drinks. And yet somehow they already knew what to do. You are roughly 12,000 years old. And you are, by every meaningful definition of the word, hungover. Here is the thing that should not make sense. You don't have ibuprofen. You don't have coffee. You don't have a greasy breakfast waiting in a foil bag. You don't even have the word hangover. And yet, the people around you, the woman tending the fire, the older man chewing something bitter, the kids who already wandered off to drink from the stream, they all know exactly what is wrong with you. They have seen this before. They have a routine for it. A quiet, practiced routine that they will run on you in the next few hours. By sundown, you will feel better. This should be impossible. A pre-agricultural human with no chemistry, no pharmacy, no written knowledge of liver enzymes, reliably bouncing back from alcohol poisoning faster than you do after a wedding. But that is what the evidence keeps pointing to. And the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Let's start with the obvious problem. Because before we can talk about the cure, we have to talk about something most people don't realize. Ancient humans were drinking. A lot, and much earlier than the textbooks used to admit. The current best guess, and I want to be careful here, because this is still an active research area, is that our ancestors weren't just stumbling onto alcohol around the time of agriculture, around 10,000 years ago. Our relationship with ethanol is much, much older than that. There is a genetic mutation in our lineage, sometimes called the drunken monkey adaptation, that allowed our ape ancestors to metabolize ethanol roughly 40 times more efficiently than their predecessors. The mutation is dated to somewhere around 10 million years ago. 10 million, which means long before we built villages, long before we kept grain in pots, long before we had a word for drink, our bodies were already adapting to the fact that fruit on the ground ferments. That when you are a hungry primate at the end of a long dry season, and the only calories left are the soft, bruised, slightly bubbling fruit at the base of the tree, you eat it, and you survive. And the apes who could process the alcohol in that fruit lived a little longer and had a few more babies than the ones who couldn't. You, sitting there with a glass of wine, are running code that is 10 million years old. So when humans finally did start brewing on purpose, and we have residue evidence of intentional fermented beverages in places like Jiahu in China going back about 9,000 years, and beer-like residues at Göbekli Tepe and Rakafet Cave, that may be even older. We weren't inventing something new. We were turning an accident into a craft. We were taking a chemical reaction our bodies already half recognized, and we were concentrating it. Which brings us to the morning after, because here is the paradox I want you to sit with for a second. A hangover is not just feeling bad. A hangover is a real, measurable, multi-system physiological event. Your blood vessels are inflamed. Your blood sugar has crashed. You are dehydrated, but in a specific way. You've lost not just water but electrolytes, especially sodium and potassium. Your stomach lining is irritated. Your liver is overloaded with a toxic metabolite called acetaldehyde, which is, frankly, more poisonous than the alcohol that made it. Your brain is short on neurotransmitters it burned through last night. Your sleep was structurally broken. And on top of all of that, you have a low-grade immune response running, which is part of why you feel achy and sad. That is a complicated problem. That is a problem that in modern terms would require fluids, electrolytes, anti-inflammatories, glucose, B vitamins, and rest. So how does a person with none of those things, no IV bag, no pharmacy, no science, fix it? This is where it starts to get strange. Because when you actually look at what ancient and early historical cultures did for the morning after, you find that almost every single remedy, across continents that had no contact with each other, lands on a small set of the same answers. Not by accident, by trial, error, death, and memory. And here is where I have to lower the dramatic music for a second and be honest with you. Because we don't have a hangover cure recipe written on a cave wall. What we have is a combination of archaeological residue, written records from the earliest literate cultures, Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Chinese, and ethnographic studies of recent traditional societies whose practices likely echo older ones. The picture we get is consistent enough that researchers take it seriously, but it's a reconstruction. The evidence suggests this is what was happening. It isn't a transcript. With that caveat in your back pocket, let me walk you through what they did. The first layer is the physical layer, the body layer. The what do you put into the broken machine layer. You wake up and someone hands you a drink. Not water. Water alone on an empty, alcohol-poisoned stomach can actually make you feel worse. It dilutes what little sodium you have left. What they hand you is something closer to a broth. Warm, salty, sometimes fermented itself. In Sumerian and Babylonian texts, we find references to using a kind of fermented grain water, basically a thin, sour beer broth, to treat morning sickness from drinking. In ancient Egypt, there are references to cabbage. Boiled cabbage, cabbage water, cabbage eaten before drinking, cabbage eaten after. The Greeks picked it up too. Aristotle mentions it. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, writes about it with the confidence of someone who has personally tested it more than once. Now, for a long time, modern readers laughed at this. Cabbage? Really? But here is where it gets stranger. Cabbage is genuinely high in a compound called sulforaphane, and the broader cruciferous family contains compounds that, in modern studies, have been shown to support the liver enzymes that break down acetaldehyde, the actual poison behind your hangover, not the alcohol itself. Cabbage water also delivers sodium, potassium, and a little glucose. So when a Roman senator's slave brought him cabbage broth at sunrise, that slave was, without knowing the biochemistry, handing him an electrolyte drink with a mild liver support supplement folded in. Did the Romans know about acetaldehyde? No. They knew that the people who drank cabbage broth got back on their feet faster, and that was enough. But here is where it gets stranger still, because the physical layer is only the first move. The second layer is the psychological one. And this one took me a while to understand. Ancient cultures, almost universally, treated the morning after as a social event, not a private one. You did not crawl off to a dark room and suffer alone with your phone face down. You sat with the people you drank with. You ate together. You complained together. You laughed at each other. In some cultures, there were specific morning after meals, heavy, fatty, salty, savory food shared in a group. In Greece, the morning after a symposium had its own small ritual. In parts of the ancient Near East, the second meal after a feast was an expected part of the event, not an optional appendix. And this matters more than it sounds. Because one of the most under-discussed parts of a modern hangover is something researchers sometimes call hangxiety, the low, gnawing dread that creeps in the morning after. Alcohol suppresses certain neurotransmitters, and as it leaves your system, your brain rebounds into a state that, biochemically, is very close to anxiety. If you sit alone in that state, it festers. If you sit in a warm room with people who are all feeling roughly the same thing, and someone is telling a story about how you tripped over a goat last night, the dread dissolves. The social environment was, in itself, half the cure. Modern medicine is just starting to seriously study the role of social co-regulation in physiological recovery. The ancients didn't study it. They lived it. They couldn't afford to not live it. A lone hungover human in a prehistoric landscape was a dead human. So recovery for them was group behavior by default, but here is where it gets even stranger, because we still haven't talked about the layer underneath that, the chemical one. The one that, to me, is the most genuinely impressive. Modern pharmacology has, in the last 20 years, started to catalog traditional hangover remedies from cultures around the world. And what is striking is how often the same kind of plant keeps showing up. In regions that had no contact, bitter plants, plants with a sharp, almost unpleasant taste, things like wormwood, gentian, certain barks, certain roots. In East Asia, there is a long tradition of using kudzu root, sometimes called ji-gen, to soften the effects of heavy drinking. In the Mediterranean, bitter herbs steeped in wine were taken before and after feasts, a tradition that survives today in the form of the bitter aperitif and the bitter digestif. Before you eat, after you eat, bookending the meal with bitterness. And here is the punchline. Many of these bitter compounds are now understood to do real specific work in the body. Some stimulate bile production, which helps the liver process fats and toxins. Some upregulate the very enzyme pathways, the cytochrome P450 family, that your liver uses to break down alcohol. Some are anti-inflammatory in the gut lining. Kudzu, specifically, has been studied in modern clinical settings for reducing alcohol craving and softening hangover symptoms. The early results are interesting enough that researchers are still chasing them. So, picture this. A Bronze Age healer hands you a bitter, awful-tasting tea. You drink it. You wince. Your grandmother nods approvingly. None of them know what cytochrome P450 is. None of them know what acetaldehyde is. But they know that the people who drink the bitter tea get up faster. They know which bark to peel. They know which root to dig. They know how much. They know when. And that knowledge was carried, in voice and in habit, across hundreds of generations, refined every time someone tried a slightly different recipe and either felt better or didn't. That, to me, is not folklore. That is an open source, peer-reviewed pharmacology project that ran for 10,000 years without anyone calling it that. And here is where I want to slow down, because we are about 3/4 of the way in. And there is one thing I want to flip on its head before we close. When you sit with all of this, the cabbage broth, the morning meal, the bitter root, the shared fire, the warm, salty soup, you start to notice something that changes the meaning of the whole question. Ancient humans didn't have a hangover cure. They had a hangover system. They didn't treat the morning after as an emergency. They treated it as a predictable phase of a known event. They built the recovery into the drinking itself. The bitter herbs went into the wine. The broth was set aside the night before. The morning meal was planned. The fire was banked so it could be revived quickly at dawn. The group was going to sit together no matter what. The remedy was not a single magical substance. The remedy was a structure, a choreography, a small, quiet, repeated set of behaviors that the whole community ran without thinking about it. And that is the line I want you to feel for a second. Because the reason you, in the modern world, feel so wrecked after a night of drinking is not that you are weaker than your ancestors. Your liver is fine. Your DNA is, for these purposes, the same DNA. What you are missing is the system. You drink in a context that was built for selling alcohol, not for recovering from it. You wake up alone. You reach for a phone instead of a bowl. You skip the bitter taste, because bitterness has been engineered out of almost everything you consume. You replace the morning broth with a sugary drink that spikes your blood sugar and crashes it again an hour later. You sit in silence in a room with the curtains closed. You have inherited the 10-million-year-old liver. You have not inherited the 10,000-year-old protocol. That, I think, is the real answer to the question we started with. How did ancient humans cure a hangover? They didn't exactly. They never let it become the kind of hangover you have. They intercepted it at every stage. They drank with herbs already mixed in. They ate before, during, and after. They slept near other people. They woke up to broth, not to silence. They had a low-grade, distributed, multi-generational technology for managing one of the oldest side effects of being human. And that technology was so deeply baked into daily life that nobody bothered to write it down as a cure. It was just how you lived. There is something almost tender about that when you sit with it. The image of a hungover human, 12,000 years ago, being handed a warm, bitter cup by someone who loves them, in a room full of people who are all a little wrecked and a little kind to each other because of it. That scene is older than agriculture. It is older than writing. It is, in some form, older than our species. And it is happening right now, somewhere in the world, in a kitchen at 9 a.m., where someone is pouring broth for a friend and saying, "Drink this. You'll feel better in an hour." They will not know why it works. They will just know that it does. The body is the same machine it was in the cave. What changed is the software around it. You are not broken. You are just running the old hardware without the old operating system. And the operating system, it turns out, was never a recipe. It was a room full of people, a warm cup, a bitter taste, and the quiet knowledge that morning always comes, and that someone somewhere has done this before and figured out how to make it bearable, long before any of us were here to ask how. That cup on your counter tomorrow morning, whatever is in it, is the last echo of a conversation that started 10 million years ago. You are not the first to hold it. You will not be the last. And the cure, in the end, was never in the cup. It was in the hands that passed it to you.